Britain still bears the marks of the World Wars, and it still remembers the terrible cost of the Napoleonic Wars. All a traveler in London has to do is look around to see how these significant conflicts shaped the nation. However, in between these wars was another battle, which cost the empire over £200 million and resulted in over 125,000 casualties. The Boer Wars may not have prominent statues, buildings, or chapters in most history books, but its impact cannot be denied as the most significant conflict in British history between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I. The Boer Wars were fought between the British Empire and two Boer republics in South Africa. There were actually two conflicts, the First Boer War and the Second Boer War, both reactions to British colonization in South Africa, specifically around Cape Colony. The Second Boer War lasted from October 11, 1899 to May 31, 1902. But while this may seem like it should have been an inconsequential conflict, the Second Boer War impacted how the international community viewed Britain's global empire and the techniques used in World War I, which began only 12 years later in 1914. The Boer War enormously influenced modern history, so it's time to examine this colonial conflict. By examining why the British and South African Boer people went to war and how they fought, we can see how their war changed the course of global history and eventually led to the international community to question the ethics of global colonization. What events led to the Boer War? Much like the war itself, the causes of the Boer War were complex and differed depending upon which side one listened to, partly because the British and the Boers had been in conflict for over a century. The Boers were descendants of European immigrants to Africa. Dutch, German, and French Huguenot settlers arrived at the Cape of New Hope in the 1650s and made their farms part of the Dutch Cape Colony. It later changed hands to the Netherlands in the late 1800s. The British occupied the colony 3 times during the Napoleonic Wars and permanently took over in 1806. The word Boer comes from the Afrikaans word for farmer, which is what many of them did for a living. They were displeased with British rule. While some left between 1836 and 1852, enough remained for tension to continue building. The Boer people who left the Cape Colony established their own independent republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. Britain attempted to annex the republics during the First Boer War from 1880 to 1881, but was unsuccessful. The Second Boer War built on these rising tensions. According to the British, they needed to protect their overlordship of the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. The countries had apparently reached agreements at the London Conventions of 1881 and 1884, but this was disputed. Some historians believe there was a more financially driven motivator, though. In 1886, gold was discovered in the Witwatersrand gold mining complex. At the time, it was the largest gold mining complex in the world, and the South African Republic controlled it. The gold discovered in 1886 allowed the South African Republic to focus on modernization, making them a threat to British colonial control of South Africa. In addition, the British money system depended on gold, so much like other countries, they were eager to control as much gold as possible. Britain immediately began working to undermine the South African Republic's independence. In 1897, Britain demanded the Republic modify its constitution to grant political rights to the British Uitlanders. The Uitlanders were British people who had moved to the area, but the Boers had previously denied them citizenship rights for economic and cultural reasons. Giving these British immigrants citizenship would give the British Empire more control over the region, because the British Uitlanders would most likely push for policies that better benefited their home country, not the interests of the Boer people. Losing ground to the British Empire did not interest the Boer people in the slightest. However, they did not leap immediately into war. Instead, they hosted the Bloemfontein Conference in May and June of 1899. The South African Republic and the Orange Free State even agreed to make some concessions to the British to stave off war. But Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner for South Africa, deemed the concessions not good enough. Milner then proceeded to call for additional British troops to support the garrison already in the area. When the Boer people saw the rising number of British forces in August and September 1899, they offered even more concessions, but Alfred Milner rejected any form of peace agreement again. The British Empire was one of the best in the world, so the British government had little reason to stop at compromises when they were determined to get exactly what they wanted. At this point, war was inevitable. The South African Republic and the Orange Free State issued an ultimatum to the British Empire on October 9, 1899. Remove the troops from the border or war would begin. Britain had 48 hours, although the only regular soldiers near the border were 4 companies who were supposed to defend the city of Kimberley. The ultimatum expired, so the Second Boer War, often referred to as the Boer War, began on October 11, 1899. What happened during the Second Boer War? Historians traditionally split this conflict into 3 phases. The first phase lasted from October 1899 to early 1900 and was marked by initial Boer victories. The Boers attacked on 2 fronts. Both attacks on the British colonies of Natal and Cape Colony surprised the British. In addition, the northern districts of Cape Colony rebelled against the British and joined the Boers' ranks, adding to the number of issues the British had to deal with. The Boers continued pushing against the British forces, laying siege to critical towns like Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley. These early Boer victories gave the South African people confidence, but sadly, their overall victory was not assured. As the British watched the mounting Boer victories, they called in additional reinforcements which arrived in early 1900. With the rising number of British troops in South Africa, the eventual British victory appeared inevitable. British military leaders Lord Kitchener and Lord Robert worked to break the Boer sieges on cities, providing relief and opening up military resources. They also defeated the Boer army on the battlefield and gained control of the rail system. By March 1900, the British military occupied critical cities like Bloemfontein, and they later captured Johannesburg and Pretoria, the capital of the South African Republic, in June of 1900. In light of the sweeping British victories, President Paul Kruger of the South African Republic traveled to Europe hoping to find allies. Although he did find a lot of sympathy for his people, he did not receive any significant help to push back the British in South Africa. By the end of 1900, the Boer army was keeping the British forces at bay with guerrilla military tactics, including hit and runs. As a result of their consistent and unpredictable attacks on British communication and the army bases, sizable rural areas of South Africa remained outside British control. For the British, that was untenable. Lord Kitchener set up blockhouses and barbed wire along the railways to protect them. When this failed to provide the British with enough protection, he turned to a scorched earth policy, a military technique where an army destroys all farmland in its path. The goal is to prevent the enemy forces from living off the land because all edible plants and animals have been destroyed. In South Africa, this meant the British destroyed the farms of both the Boers and the black African people. They gathered up rural inhabitants into segregated concentration camps, where the people suffered inhumane, unhygienic conditions. Several thousand people died. The international community was outraged at the suffering in the camps, especially at the plight of the Boer women and children. However, despite international outrage, the British continued to press on. Lord Kitchener's tactics were brutal but finally tipped the scales toward a British victory. At this point, most of the conflict was reduced to small-scale skirmishes, so most fatalities were due to illness, not battle. The Boer army split into groups that wanted to surrender and even worked with the British, and groups that wanted to continue fighting to the bitter end. However, the British had essentially won the war. All that was left was negotiating the peace treaty and discovering precisely how much the Boer people had lost. What were the consequences of the Boer War? The war ended in May 1902 with the Treaty of Vereeniging. The British had initially offered peace in March 1901, but the Boers rejected it at the time because the peace included conditions about the British annexing the formerly independent South African lands. However, by 1902, the Boers' situation had become so desperate that their leaders agreed to peace. The peace treaty contained promises of local self-government, giving the British immigrants citizenship rights, restoring and managing the gold mines efficiently, and an alliance between the Boers and the British against the black African people. However, the consequences of the Boer War stretched far beyond a new political agreement. Historians estimate that almost 100,000 people died during the war, either as combatant casualties or non-combatants. At least 26,000 of those people were Boer women and children in their concentration camps, and historians think anywhere from 13,000 to 20,000 black Africans also died in those camps. Internationally, the Boer War further poisoned relationships between the great European powers, adding more fuel to the explosion of World War I in 1914. While there were many volunteers on the British side, specifically from their other colonies such as Australia, India, and Canada, not everyone in the British Empire supported the war. This push against British imperialism extended to the international stage, causing neutral countries like Germany, Russia, and the United States to speak out in favor of the Boer people. Some historians believe this war was the beginning of the end of the British Empire and its broadly accepted world dominance. While this conflict had significant international consequences, the war also shaped the culture and society of South Africa for almost a century. The engagement did nothing to improve relations between the Boers and the British immigrants, but it greatly impacted the black Africans, many of whom were involved in the conflict. Thousands died in the concentration camps. Many fought on either side. Some farmers saw a time of prosperity as both armies needed food and water. But most black Africans suffered as a result of the war. They lost jobs and were evicted from their lands. But despite their clear presence throughout the Boer War, the most surprising part was how the British and the Boers attempted to exclude the black African people. The Treaty of Vereeniging explicitly excluded black Africans from political rights, leaving South Africa to be run by a white minority rule. The impacts of this choice have haunted South Africa to this day, as the country is still working through the effects of apartheid. The Boer War was a critical episode in the British Empire and the development of modern South Africa. This war showed the damage that a desire for power can bring, and it also highlighted how systemic racism can negatively impact a country. Although the British won, the costs of the war proved much higher than anticipated, resulting in thousands of deaths of people who were not even involved. The consequences of the Boer War have outlasted the war and continue to impact lives today. By learning about this critical part of international history, we can see the dangers of power and possibly see a way to move forward and finally allow for healing. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the Boer War, check out our Captivating History book series, available as ebooks, paperbacks, and audiobooks. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.